thank you all for being here. I'm going to see if I get this microphone working. Everybody knows Fran Townsend, so I'm not going to do a long introduction, except that she's been an inspiration to this conference and everything else. She was President Bush's White House Homeland Security Advisor, and I think the first deputy of the Coast Guard for Intelligence, right? Commandant for Intelligence, many other things, now at Baker and Botts. Let's leap right in, which is Admiral Mullen. It struck me last night that twice, unbidden, he kept talking about synergies between terrorist groups. How does that affect your thinking on homeland security and domestic terrorism?
Well, you know, let's start with, remember the Christmas Day attempt. And in the wake of the Christmas Day attempt, John Brennan, my successor, came out and explained that the connection to al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was somewhat surprising to them. This had been a regional group that suddenly had targeted inside the homeland. And then we had Christmas Day and that attempt in Times Square, and the administration came out and explained that the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, which had been a localized regional group, they had been surprised that it had expanded to directly make an attempt on the homeland. And so I think what we're seeing, when the Admiral talks about synergies, I think what he's talking about is the difficulty in getting into the decision cycle of, for an attack. That is, suddenly you find groups that they don't share a membership, but they share a belief in particular tactics. They may share a belief in similar targets in terms of targeting American interests, whether it's at home or abroad. And suddenly you find these like-minded in different ways these groups come together to share either training, tactics, money, people. It becomes much harder. You're no longer targeting a single group, but you're targeting this matrix network of groups that share certain things in common.
When you were at the White House, was that already happening, or is this something new?
Well, we began to see it. We began to see things.
Why don't you pull your mic up just a little, I think, yeah.
We began to see things like a consolidation of efforts. You saw a group in North Africa, the GSPC, align itself with al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. And so you began to see these alliances around the world, the Abu Sayyaf group in Indonesia, Jamaah Islamiyah, all these groups began, all of a sudden, this I won't say strange alliance, but this confluence of events. We understood that they had real priority for those who were either Americans or had American travel documents. We were working with our British colleagues in particular to look at travel patterns around the world, and we understood that there was this network that was forming. And we were watching it very closely. I mean, I think we're now seeing some of the results of that effort on the al-Qaeda side.
Why is this happening? Are we doing something wrong in which we're actually allowing this federation to occur or even encouraging it?
I don't think so. I mean, some of this is the current administration has been incredibly aggressive against al-Qaeda in the tribal areas of Pakistan. I think the more you put pressure on the core of the network, the more you're likely to see. I mean, my children, you know, you push down on a ball in the water and the water spreads out, it rises. I think that's part of what you're seeing. You're seeing a natural reaction to a tremendous amount of pressure. It started in the prior administration, but frankly, stepped up in the current administration against the core of the network, and I think that's part of it.
Well, so how should we readjust our tactics?
We've always understood that our relationships with foreign partners is incredibly important. And let's be honest, not all foreign partnerships are created equal. Not all partners have got equal capability. And so some are more valuable, some are more transparent, some are more consistent than others. And I'm happy if people are interested to talk about that. But you understand that as the homegrown threat, as you see these loose affiliations strengthen, and the homegrown threat rise, you've got to rely more on your partners for indications and warning before an attack. You've got to rely more on state and local partners because particularly with the homegrown threat, the people who are most likely to see an anomaly in a state and local community are your local police forces and sheriffs. And so it underscores the importance of that relationship. And then third, I really think we've got to do a better job at engaging the American people. Look, in some ways, we're a victim of our own success. We haven't seen a major attack in the United States since 9/11. We've seen increasing real attempts. But even those attempts, when you compare it to the scale of 9/11, where 3,000 Americans were killed, you see a guy with a bad bomb in his underwear that doesn't go off, or a bomb insufficiently put together in Times Square. And I think people take sort of an unjustified comfort in that. It's not a matter of scaring people, but it's a matter of emphasizing to them that the threat continues to be real. And even state and locals will not be successful without the help of the American people.
So when you say engaging the American public, are you asking people to sort of watch out for their neighbors and that sort of thing?
You know, I think of this in a number of different ways in the engaging the American people. I do think that you have to engage them, but in a very specific, look, what you're not looking, you don't want Americans running around every day frightened about the next attack. This is not a question, because that's not effective. What you want to do is be able to talk to people so that they're prepared in their own minds for what I think is inevitable. I mean, you don't see, Jean Meserve was talking about 25 arrests this year for terrorism. There's been a number of very well-known attempts, whether it's the train backpack bomb attempt, the Times Square, the Detroit plane. Inevitably, one of these is going to be successful. And so I think part of the engagement is talking to the American people and preparing them for what may be the eventuality of the next attack. By the way, if there is another attack, part of the reason you want to talk to them is to begin to understand even a successful attack on the scale of a Times Square or a Detroit bomber, while tragic if someone is hurt or killed. When you compare that to the level of effort and the success on 9/11 that al-Qaeda saw, this is going to be their failure, if that's the best they can do. But you're not going to be able to say that in the midst of a crisis. You've got to talk to the American people about what terrorism is and what it's likely to look like going forward. And I don't think we do a very good job at that. I do think part of it is enlisting their help, but then you've got to tell them what it is you want from them, not just sort of this generalized, be afraid, call the police. It's tell them what you need them to look for. And then finally, I think it's a matter of engaging them in the privacy, civil liberties debate. You know, in a crisis, the executive branch of government will make that balance for you. And I can tell you, having served, looking backwards, the American people will criticize how that decision got made. That's, you know what? That's what we get paid the big bucks for. That's okay, right? But why not, if you don't like the way your government makes those decisions in a crisis, then you want to engage them now. You want to engage them before the crisis because, frankly, you will affect, the American people have the ability to affect, not only by elections, but by public debate, their views on how that balance should be made, whether we're talking about terrorism or cybersecurity or information sharing. There is a real value. And I think you can't expect, if the response to this is, well, why doesn't the government begin that public debate? I think the answer is because it's become the third rail of American politics. This notion of data mining and information sharing and what can the government know or not know. And so I think politicians don't see it as in their interest. So I really think it requires sort of a grassroots debate with the American people. Do you
think that we've calibrated it wrong, that we're too fanatic about privacy, that we don't do enough data mining?
I think there are ways to do it if we could have the conversation and sort of an intelligent, knowledgeable conversation. I think there are ways that we can do more. I mean, after all, everybody here logs onto the internet. And everybody here will notice, after they've done a couple searches, that the sidebar ads are suddenly what you've been searching for. Guess what? All of the private sector does this. It's part of how they understand their markets, their customers. It's how they target advertising. So there are ways to do this. And the answer is, I think we need to talk about it, because I do think we're not taking full advantage of a capability that's available to us that we don't necessarily use because it's so controversial.
And also, it would seem that part of the problem is we're not information sharing even within the agencies. I mean, do you think there's a problem with the FBI, local, state and local, and Department of Homeland Security still siloing information?
Forget what I think. I mean, look at what happened on Christmas, right? I mean, we had an awful lot of information in the system that we didn't take advantage of. And so, you know, I was fond of saying when I was in government and would have been the victim of this next statement, so I think I can still say it. You know, the American people were reasonably forgiving of the mistakes their government made on 9/11 in failing to connect the dots. But I would tell my staff, and publicly I used to say, they won't be forgiving a second time, and they have a right to expect of their government not to make the same mistake twice. I will tell you, Zoe Baird is here, has done a lot of work on information sharing at the Markle Foundation. There are others. This is one that just makes me angry. The technology exists. This is not a technology problem. It's a failure of policy and it's a failure of leadership. You know, look, when I was in government, there was a national information sharing policy and strategy that was meant to sort of lead the interagency through this. But it can't be that it's an acceptable mistake to not share information and that we sort of throw up our hands and move on. It's not okay. And I frankly...
When you say it's a failure of policy, what's the policy failure?
Well, there's no... You see something like Christmas Day, where information is either not adequately inputted or not adequately shared. And frankly, it can't be that we sort of acknowledge that and move on from that and that there's no consequences. I venture to say that if the President of the United States calls his cabinet, and you'll have a chance to ask Mike Chertoff, who's here somewhere, if the President of the United States calls in his cabinet and says, the next time this happens, I am not going to hold the agency accountable, I'm going to hold the cabinet. A cabinet member will be fired if his agency fails to share information. You betcha that that's going to get shared. You betcha that a cabinet head, cabinet secretary is going to take personal responsibility to make sure that he beats his or her agency into submission. And we haven't seen that. I mean, I think it's that important. I do think that it requires a clear vision and accountability from the White House on down through the system, because left to their own devices, look, I want to be clear, this is not an issue of malevolence among the agencies. There's no, the notion that somebody's actually affirmatively making a conscious decision to take a report and hide it under the desk is more often than not accurate. That's not the way it happens. But it requires more than benign neglect. It actually requires an affirmative conscious decision every single day that this is a priority, and if we fail, people will be held accountable. And I still don't see that energy, that passion in this issue. And this is not the thing that's sort of sexy that people want to, have be their defining issue. On the other hand, if we don't do it well, it can be the cause of an attack.
It seems that from 9/11 to the Christmas Day bombing, that's all the same. It's a failure of information sharing.
It's, to be fair to my colleagues who continue to serve, I think it's better. And I do think that there's effort put against this. But I will tell you that the problem with this is every time you have a problem on Christmas Day, there's a lot of attention put against this at very senior levels of the government. And then everybody goes back to their day job, and it begins to slowly dissipate and go back to the way it was. And that's why I say, it requires very senior level attention and literally a whip at this every single day, or it doesn't happen. I wish I could tell you, well, let's just build the right system and it'll go away. It won't. It's going to require individual human attention, but systems do exist that allow the lion's share, if people really bought in and it was a demand of the president's. The systems, the technology exists. You could have this all happening, but agencies refuse to put data in, even with protections.
Is there any one person responsible for assuring data sharing?
Well, this has moved around a little bit. There is the Office of Information Sharing and the Director of National Intelligence among their 86 other missions, and I will skip sort of all the controversy that's currently swirling around ODNI. There is person in the White House in the Homeland Security Council that reports to the Homeland Security Advisor, who's responsible for working the interagency. But it's not, I mean, far be it from me to be calling, what I don't think we need is one more czar. But this ought to be part and parcel of the mission of the person who's responsible for cybersecurity. I mean, there is a way to manage this cross-government that solves this problem if there's the will. I mean, this is really fundamentally a question of will to solve it, because it can be solved. I mean, that's why it makes me mad. That's why I'm frustrated by it.
So what would you do if you could issue an executive order this afternoon?
Oh, the executive order would require, I mean, I think we've learned some lessons about trying to solve big problems in one big gulp, right? I mean, I think the Department of Homeland Security was the right effort. We started with too many agencies, and of course it was a more difficult integration as a result of that. And so I think you've got to be mindful of solving big problems in a single bite often doesn't work the way you planned. And so I think you start with those things you care most about in the intelligence and law enforcement communities. There are legal restrictions on the sharing of some of that information. All those rules can be written to protect that information appropriately. The anonymization of data to allow that information, the relevant information, to be surfaced to the top and on predication be looked at and investigated and followed. All of that exists. The executive order in its initial stage has got to say to the law enforcement and intelligence communities, this information is all going in because the President of the United States has decided it's
all going in what?
All going into a single system.
Do we have a single system?
Well, no, because the agencies won't put it all in. I mean, if you go out to a place, I encourage you to ask Mike Leiter, who struggles with this issue, quite frankly, every day at the NCTC. You've got all the systems are present there, but they're not integrated into a single system. So
Why
that
not?
Because the agencies who own that data won't permit that to happen. Now, let us be fair. When you say that, there's a vulnerability that's inherent to putting them into a single system. Because if it's in a single system, if that single system gets corrupted, you now have access to all of it.
But
right.
isn't there a vulnerability to not putting it in a single system?
Yes, you're making my argument, so I'm with you. I agree with you. I think that the benefit of it to the country in terms of identifying threats, identifying patterns, is worth the risk. And the risk can be managed and mitigated, and you got lots of smart people in the room, Madi and others who are here, who understand very well how to do that.
Are we moving in that direction yet?
If we are, it's not fast enough. I mean, I don't see enough movement. Quite frankly, I think for many of us in the counterterrorism community, over the last 2 decades, Christmas Day is a little bit shocking. I mean, it's got to be to Senator Hart and to Zoe Baird and people who've worked on this issue. The notion that we find ourselves making some of the same mistakes is frustrating and frankly dishonoring to those that we lost on September the 11th, in my mind.
Wow.
Yeah.
Zoe, you've had a couple of shout-outs. Give Zoe a microphone. Let her ask the follow-up question.
Uh-oh.
Do we have a microphone or just want to shout it out? I don't know. All right. Shout it out. I'll repeat it. Obviously, the mic runners are not.
Okay.
Do you have a microphone back there? I don't know why they aren't bringing them up.
Zoe's question was so having said that there's this vulnerability to talk about cybersecurity, so I'm going to talk a little bit while they run around for microphones.
Yeah. Sorry, where are the mic runners? We're not, all right, just one, I guess, yeah. Actually, Zoe, did you want to say more now that you have a mic?
No, I'd like to hear Fran say more about cybersecurity. Thank you.
It's a 2-word question,
Sure.
Cybersecurity.
Let's start with, look, I think the president made an important speech and began what should be a very important effort. I can remember talking to those who succeeded me and said, be careful of all your vision and your great ambitions when you get into office, because kind of the tyranny of the inbox gets in your way. And I think they found a good deal of that. The president didn't choose the BP oil spill, but it's something that absolutely must be dealt with. And so I think that there have been some setbacks for them and some other things they've had to deal with. That said, I think there needs to be a fundamental recognition on the part of the federal government that no matter how important they think the cybersecurity issue is, nor what their sort of intentions and commitment are to it. The federal government cannot solve this problem. By the way, that's like people in Washington are allergic to say they can't do something. But
you're talking about a public-private partnership?
That's right. I mean, but different than anything I think we've ever done. I mean, I think you actually need a common sort of physical location and a common understanding between the public and private sector where we sit together and talk about the intellectual capital here, the capabilities are in the private sector. While we have some capability in the federal government, it's not as much as we need and it's not what we need to solve this problem. And so oftentimes what you find in Washington is people make policy not understanding second and third order consequences to it. This is an area in which we ought to invite the private sector in to help in the debate and conversation about what policy ought to be and how we ought to implement it. Because, by the way, they own the critical infrastructure that we're talking about. The government rides on a private backbone. And no more, where is that most obvious to us, but in the military. There are some good, important pockets of public-private partnership. But our allies, you need to bring your foreign allies in. Zoe and I were talking about this earlier. And there's deep suspicion among some of our allies in terms of the U.S. cybersecurity effort. And so I really think that, frankly, the U.S. government shouldn't be the convening body. You're going to hear from Rod Beckstrom later in the conference. You need to have a platform, a convening authority, whether it's ICANN or it's the Markle Foundation, but you need some non-governmental body to bring together both the international community and make a public-private partnership with government, but have this dialogue and have it begin as a non-governmental effort. I don't think this is going to be easy. I mean, let's be honest. The U.S. government's going to come with deep suspicions. We know from public reporting both the Chinese and the Russians have tremendous capability. Nowhere is that felt more greatly than in the private sector that gets frankly stolen blind every day. Our innovation, our creativity, our research and development dollars get literally thrown out the window when China and Russia can steal things from us that we've paid for. And we see very little effort to protect or prosecute those thefts of intellectual property. And so I really think this is not only requires a public-private partnership, but of a different nature than anything we've ever seen.
A cyber attack, is it most likely to come from a major state actor like China and Russia, or a terrorist group, or whom?
You know, it's interesting. I mean, when you're in government and you're responsible, you worry about all of it. As a personal matter, I think it is less likely to be a terrorist act, although we've heard bin Laden make statements about wanting to wreak economic havoc on the U.S. We know it would. I don't think it's most likely to be in that vein because we know that terrorist groups use the internet to communicate, train, recruit, finance. And so I think it's less likely. I do think it is more likely that you're going to see it from a state actor, some sort of state, if not an actual government, a state actor.
Have we already seen it?
Well, yeah, I think, look, I can tell you what we've seen in the press, and people here know it better than I, and I expect you'll hear about it from folks like Dick Clark when he talks. Yeah, we have seen it, and we've seen multiple efforts, whether it's, beware of the thumb drive you get given at a foreign conference and stick into your system. CENTCOM learned that lesson. Mm-hmm. We have seen these sort of what appear to be state-sponsored efforts.
And when you say public-private partnership, you're talking Microsoft, Cisco, Google, or are you talking what?
No, I think it's across a broad spectrum of the private sector. There are, by the way, I can remember having these debates inside the prior administration, and Secretary Rice was very outspoken about the need to include, when you're talking about public-private partnership, academia. Mm-hmm. Mike McConnell, the DNI, also felt strongly about that. And so I do think this is a broad-based public-private partnership that is less about the government sort of pushing information out, which is kind of how the government thinks about public-private partnership. And it's about a real two-way street, a real dialogue.
But are you saying that, say, Cisco mm-hmm. or Google should collaborate with the U.S. government? Well,
I think there have got to be rules. I mean, when you say that, I think the first thing my colleagues from the private sector, the Googles and Ciscos, think, we're not sharing information, we're not allowing our systems to be corrupted, we're not doing sort of untoward things with the federal government. I'm not suggesting they should be doing that sort of stuff. What I'm talking about is sharing the intellectual capital.
By the way,
that's
I'm
there
not
to
suggesting
solve.
that they should not be doing that.
Well, no,
Maybe they should be.
Well, but if they're going to do that, there have to be rules and understandings about how that is. And I do think that there is a legitimate debate to be had about public-private partnerships. Frankly, I raised with a CEO in one of the big software companies, why don't you sponsor? If the government won't do this, why doesn't the industry do it? And frankly, the industry is reluctant to stick their head up out of that trench, frankly, for the very reason that they're afraid they'll be perceived as in some sort of unholy alliance with the government. And we got to find a way to be able to have that dialogue, because it's not being had.
Are we going to have a wake-up call on cybersecurity at some point?
My great fear, and I hope I'm wrong, my great fear is we're not going to see real progress in this area until there's some sort of cataclysmic 9/11 type cyber event.
What would that be like?
Well,
what's your nightmare?
My two.
Two nightmares.
Yeah,
Go
no.
ahead.
Why limit yourself?
Yeah, right.
My two. One is the financial system. I hasten to add that of the many sectors, the financial sector is among the most sophisticated in this area. But again, they often are reluctant to share information with the government for proprietary and business reasons. The other is in a transportation or electricity sector. That is, imagine your air traffic control system going down because somebody's affirmatively taken it down, or the lights going out, as Michael and I played through in Cyber Shockwave, this exercise, as lights are going out across the Northeast.
Was the creation of the Department of Homeland Security a dumb idea?
No, I don't. Well, boy, I guess Michael will have to. Michael, prepare yourself for this question. No, I don't think it was a dumb idea. You know, with the benefit now of hindsight, might I have suggested we go about it a little differently? Yes. Because, as I said earlier, you know, when you decide to solve a big problem in a single step, you know, it doesn't always go smoothly. And so I think what we really wanted in the early going of the department was a border agency that really looked at people and things that cross borders. And so imagine a smaller scoped department that started there and then added things on.
With Coast Guard and INS.
Right, and CBP and ICE and that sort of configuration, and then you could have added things. Look, I think the department's overcome the challenge of sort of trying to do too much. We heard Deputy Secretary Lute talk about we're not in the first year 7 times in a row. We're now seeing the gains of it. But I think we might have seen some of those gains more quickly if we'd started more modestly. But I think it was the right thing, and it was the right idea.
Well, do DHS and the FBI still silo information and not cooperate?
I think, you know, that you're talking about a work in progress. This was enormously...
That means yes?
Yeah. They're better, but it's by no means solved. And I think people hide behind rules that allow them to keep information out of the system or away from one another. Look, I think they're getting better, but this is part of with enough will, you can solve this problem. By the way, I think DHS, it's not just FBI, DHS has got information that the FBI wants and has trouble getting access to. So I don't think, to be fair now, I don't think this is all on the FBI side. I think it's on both sides. I think they want to solve it, they just can't seem to get out of their own way. I know. Look, this is the FBI. Let's talk about the Bureau for a minute. Post 9/11, this has been an agency that has undergone a good deal of cultural change. I mean, I hate that sort of phrase, but they've had this new National Security Division. They have a whole priority at preventing terrorism, not just responding. And they're growing agents. They're hiring agents into the FBI who don't necessarily see their promotions based on the number of arrests, which, of course, by the way, was the way they did do it for many years. But that's a work in progress. And so there really is a cultural shift inside the Bureau. And as with any big organization, you're going to go through growing pains with that. On the other hand, you've got a Department of Homeland Security that is nascent. This is that it's 7 or 8 years old. It's a baby in the federal system, and it's still fighting for its rightful place at the policy table. And so all those things contribute to an environment where that they sometimes find it difficult to understand each other and share. I'm not excusing it, but I mean, I think we have to be realistic about what the circumstances are that they're in.
Secretary Chertoff, you want to add to that or say something or question?
Was I not?
Is the microphone being run to you? Yes, sir.
The secretary will be sure to tell me if I was not vociferous enough in my defense.
No. Actually, what I would say is really come back to the point that Fran made earlier, which was very perceptive, but you can miss in the issue of information sharing. I don't think the problem at this point is so much a question of the wiring diagram where people saying, oh, here's a nice piece of information, I'm not going to share it. It is the going through a huge field of data you have and figuring out what is important enough to share and what is a priority to share and what's not a priority to share. Because that's what happens. People get swamped with information and they don't always properly understand what is of value to other people. So that, I think, is what the challenge is. And I think Fran really put a finger on it. The way you overcome that is by driving it from the top, by making it very clear what the priority missions are. So if your priority mission is, I want to know about any reasonable threat that's out there in a short to medium term, and you drive the organizations to handle their data and exchange it and focus on it with that as your outcome. And if you do that relentlessly, and we used to sit once a week with the President of the United States, and believe you me, if there was an unanswered question in the morning, by the afternoon, you better have an answer. That is what drives organizations. Otherwise, they lapse into habits of behavior, which I think result in sometimes missing things that ought to be caught.
Can I just add to that? Because
sure.
I think...
Well, keep the microphone if you would, Secretary, because I want to, yeah.
I really think
have a dialogue.
That we ought to get to a place where it doesn't require, I mean, look, in my perfect world, it doesn't require the meeting in the Oval Office, and it doesn't require, we used to also, and they still do, by the way, I'm pretty sure, 3 times a day video conferences. Bill Gates is laughing. He was one of the victims of those. 3 times a day video conferences to follow the threats. I mean, Marty, you can speak to this. The systems exist that you don't need Mike and I calling each other to say, did we answer that question? Is the most current threat information being shared? You can develop a system that allows, you can set those priorities and have that happen without human beings having to go through a conscious thought process. And that's where we need to be, because human beings are going to get busy and they're going to make mistakes. But if you can set the priorities right, you reduce the likelihood that you're going to miss a critical piece of information. And so I think we need to evolve to the next level of that.
But could we have an information system, I sort of asked Fran this, but both of you could address it, in which state and local governments, the FBI, and DHS are all expected to put it into one information system?
Yeah, you could do that. And Bill Bratton, maybe we'll talk about this a little later. They had the idea in LA of beginning a program of suspicious activity reporting. Remember, we've been talking about intelligence. In your mind's eye, most people here are probably thinking about stuff we're collecting in the field in Afghanistan or Pakistan, or we're getting through satellites or spies. But in this day and age, a lot of it is what you get in the streets of our own cities. So, Bill and people in LA put together this program of suspicious activity reporting. And our idea was not simply to have it come into one place like DHS and have DHS look at it and analyze it, but to create a network of servers that would give any fusion center in the country the opportunity to look at what was flowing in. DHS and FBI would have an opportunity to do that as well, but not to be a gatekeeper, to allow the information to be available to everybody. You'd have to have a common template and certain rules about validation so you don't get a lot of garbage. I think, frankly, that caused some negative reaction from people who believe that every time you collect or, God forbid, analyze and fuse information, we're on the road to totalitarianism. But if you can overcome that knee-jerk objection, I think a combination of a distribution of the data over network system and the kind of analytic tools that allow you to sift the data in real time using algorithms and what we don't say anymore, which is data mining, but you'd say kind of data analysis. That's how you get by that issue. You have to get that in place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean,
And would you put like the entire airline reservation system in that too? In other words, public-private data mining?
Well, I think that's it's a little bit different. I mean, you'd like to be able to add that in, right? I mean, in the first instance, what you'd like to see is the federal government looks at the national intelligence system and sees certain threats emerging. That information's got to go down to the fusion centers so somebody like Bill Bratton in LA can then organize his force to make sure they're alert. They understand where the threat's coming from and they can collect. You then want to be able to get that information back. I think that's what Mike's talking about, getting it back in. By the way, you know, the federal government loves forms. This has got to be absolutely easy for the guy in his cruiser, right? He hits one button one time and he's done putting that information in. And then you have distributed analysis. But the federal government has the ability to look at it across the country at a national level and discern patterns and then share that back. But you want to see an intelligence loop, an analytics loop. We're getting there, but we're not there yet.
Well, explain to me, suppose somebody in Bossier City buys a whole lot of strange fertilizer and all sorts of chemicals, and a local cop arrests them. Does that go in a data system somewhere?
Well, what you would hope happens is that goes back into the fusion center. Where's Mike? That goes into the regional fusion center. By the way, we're looking to see.
Do we have that now?
Yeah, you've got Mike built when he was out there. We built these fusion centers, and they are working. Some, not all are equal, right? Not all of them have got the same capability yet. But as they mature, you will find that it really is the first line of analytic defense, where you can look at this information and then push it back in both directions.
Kimberly, yeah. You know, yeah.
Here we go.
I don't know where we are with the microphones. Yeah. Yeah.
Kimberly Dozier with the AP. I'm going to ask the impolitic question because you're up for it. You all had at least 6 years during the Bush administration to address some of these things. You have a lot of carryover in the current Obama administration in the CT community. Nick Rasmussen is there. One of your staffers, Michelle Malvesti, helped flatten the organization. Mm-hmm. So they're aware of these problems. Still trying to fix them. Are you saying that Faisal Shahzad wouldn't have happened? No, not Faisal Shahzad. Abdul Muttalib's attack wouldn't have happened under the previous administration? Or are you saying that they simply haven't kept up the pace from the Oval Office to keep driving the agencies to do what you all were already doing, to marshal this information together?
The beauty of this is being no longer in government. I can tell her I don't like the choices she's given me. I am not saying that it wouldn't have happened under the prior administration. In fact, I feel quite confident. This is not about a political view of the world. This is not about a political party. It would have happened, right? If it was going to happen and hadn't been caught, it wouldn't have mattered who was in the Oval Office. So I am most certainly not saying that. I have been concerned about the time and attention against this issue. But I will be honest. I struggled to get time and attention for this issue when I was in John Brennan's seat, and I know the struggle that can be when you're dealing, in my case, Katrina, his case with BP, right? I mean, it's hard, but that's why you need somebody. I don't think you want the person in that seat. I think there needs to be somebody whose full-time, dedicated, cross-government job it is to solve this problem. And I don't think that you can expect, whether it's the National Security Advisor or the Homeland Security Advisor, who've got a lot of other responsibilities, to be able to do that themselves. And so, yeah, I'm not satisfied with the amount of time and attention, but I think in some ways we haven't organized ourselves right to give this the precedence and priority it really requires.
Just wanted to pick up on the point, AGD International. I just wanted to pick up on the point you mentioned before from an artificial intelligence point of view. There's no way that humans at this point, with the volumes of information out there and the numbers of signals and the variety of signals, could basically set a constant agenda on their own. And therefore, in our company, for example, we're working on solutions which automatically set up an intelligence agenda. So I completely support the point that you made, and this way you can actually cope with the amount of signals out there.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, this is, you know, I'm talking to Mike Leiter, you say there are so many dots, even relevant dots, you can't make sense of them. And so forget not connecting them. You can't even understand them. You can't comprehend them all, which is why you need the systems to organize that in a way that help you make sense of them and prioritize.
Yes, right there.
Hi, my name is Bob Griffin. I'm the CEO of I2. In full disclosure, I will tell you we've been involved in information sharing initiatives for a very long time. One of the largest information sharing initiatives in the world is in Southern California, spearheaded by Chief Bratton when he was there. That consists of more than 280 jurisdictions, all sharing information across 4 different states. I'm going to tell you the challenge about that we haven't solved yet. They desperately want to be able to push that information to the federal government. And they are asking for nothing more than indemnifying themselves if a federal agent should ever misuse that information, that they don't have liabilities associated. And the response that continues to come back is, with the federal government, we don't indemnify. So as a result, there's 250 million records that are not getting to where they need to get to long term because of issues regarding something as simple as indemnification and misuse. And county councils and city councils and local attorneys at the city levels will say, why should we take the risk of sharing this information if we have liabilities associated with it?
Right, and that is a failure of leadership. I mean, I'm just straight and simple. There's no good comeback to that. That shouldn't be. And somebody in the federal government, whether it's a DHS or the Justice Department, needs to give comfort to the state and locals who are willing to provide the information. That's nonsense. That should not be, and that is a failure of leadership. And I would have, by the way, for those of you sort of wondering, I'd have said the exact same thing if I was still in the executive branch. So that shouldn't be, period. Isn't it? It's great not being in government anymore. I don't have to worry about what anybody thinks.
Yeah. Yes, way back there. Yeah. Once you stand up, yeah. I don't know why we can't seem to, yeah.
Just happen to be in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Sarah Catanzaro from the Center for Advanced Defense Studies. So our conversation today, and even right now, seems to be focused on the jihadist threat and state actors, but we seem to be ignoring other domestic terrorist groups. I wanted to see if you could speak to what efforts or progress has been made in monitoring these groups.
Let me make sure I understand. You're talking about like ELF, environmental groups, that sort of thing. I want to make sure I address your question. Okay. Yeah. I was surprised. When I was in the White House, folks would say to me, how often did those sorts of things come up? Because it's not what you hear about publicly policymakers talk about. And I was actually surprised at the number of events. They tended to be episodic, whether it's an environmental group attacking a nuclear power plant, crossing a wire, burning down a housing development. But there are more of those than I think most Americans really appreciate. I will tell you that there are units in the FBI devoted to nothing else. If you don't hear about it, they don't talk about it as much. But I will tell you that I think people would be surprised at the amount of resources, including in the local joint terrorism task forces around the country. This happens to be a problem that is greater in some places, but not a problem in others. But where there is a problem, the Joint Terrorism Task Forces have squads devoted to this, and they try to penetrate those groups. They use almost all the same techniques that you'd imagine us using against international terrorism.
Yeah. Sean Watterson asked this morning. Okay, yeah, sorry. Is that? Yeah, Richard. Yeah, right behind you.
Hi, Richard Benveniste. Sticking with the deja vu all over again. And on the narrow question, we mentioned the continued difficulties of FBI sharing information, and thank you for your observation about it going both ways for once with DHS to FBI. But in what I thought was a pretty comprehensive report by Senator Feinstein's Intelligence Committee, identifying the failures to detect the Christmas Day bombing, was mention of, again, the FBI's inability to communicate within itself as a systemic failure. Time and time again, we've heard about these problems, the FBI coming into the 21st century. What's your observation on that, and what is it going to take to finally have them get it right?
Boy, I do put this in the category of sort of the information sharing and my frustration about it. Mike and I happened to be in the Oval Office when Director Mueller had a report to the president that after more than $100 million spent, that the system he was planning to implement wasn't going to work. Part of that is explained by a lack of expertise inside the procurement system and inside the FBI itself in terms of information technology. But that's not an excuse. After all, let's remember, by the way, as long as we're talking about a failure to share information between DHS and FBI, in the most recent Fort Hood shooting, there was a failure to share information between DOD and FBI. And so this is not a circumscribed, narrow problem. It is a very broad problem. Director Mueller has really invested personally a good deal of time and attention into this. You know, I'm not on his advisory committee, and so I don't any longer have visibility into what the improvements have or haven't been. I have always worried, though, about a system, to speak more broadly, Richard, this is a system that is case-driven. Hank Crumpton will appreciate, if you file everything you know according to a case number that's against an individual, that means there's intelligence in there that may not be related to that individual, but may be related to a group or to a different individual that never gets really comprehended by the system and then put in so that an artificial intelligence program could pull it to your attention. That's the fundamental problem to me. Even if they have the best case management system in the whole world, they will still not have solved the problem I just talked about. And I think that's, if they don't, until they solve that problem, they won't know what they know. Forget what they don't know. And I think that's really worth sort of the long-term investment to solve.
Yeah, Richard. Just as a follow-up. Would you bring the microphone up, please?
There are probably 20 people here in Aspen this week who could help the FBI solve that problem quickly from the private sector. And what frustrates me in thinking about this, because we've heard these apologies repeatedly and the expenditure of more than $100 million over time, and still it's not yet fixed. What does it take? Does it take the President of the United States to bring in a task force? Who is going to get this right-sided?
I do. Look, I'm a great believer in setting clear priorities and accountability. You know, I think there's a good argument to be made for the President to decide that he is going to very clearly task the FBI with solving this problem and directing them to bring in the outside help that they need. Look, the government at all levels has never been very good at public-private partnerships, even modest ones. We're trying to get, you can see I haven't been out very long. They're trying to get better at it. I mean, I think they're acting in good faith. But this is the kind of question, again, when it comes to information and information technology, that they need outside help with, that they've got to bring in. But I think you're absolutely right. I think it's got to be solved, or we're going to have another event where we're going to find there was something in an FBI case file that didn't get shared because they didn't know they had it.
I know there's a question back there, but let me just follow up. Is part of the problem just the public is so afraid of total information awareness and information sharing that we get kind of paranoid about it because we haven't educated the public well enough?
I think that's right. Look, people in Washington watch one scandal after another. Those of us who've watched this issue have all remember the case of John Poindexter and total information awareness and watched what happened to his career, a real public servant who was trying new and creative things. My answer to this is, if you can't do it inside government, there are people, to Richard's point, in this room and in this country, in the private sector, who do those very things. The question is there a way to bring that in and set the policy rules that allow you to use them in a way to take advantage of it? I think the answer to that question is yes, but this requires real hard work by people like Richard and others who are on the outside and understand both the policy community and the technology
But you know, there is a constituency of what I will call the privacy advocacy constituency, sometimes even knee-jerk among the public, but there's no constituency in the other direction that says, hey, share our information a bit.
Well, that's right. And part of that is because I think the natural constituency on the other side are in government, right? They're in the executive branch. And when they make that argument, as Mike Chertoff said, they get accused of totalitarianism, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, and so you really need, that's why I say you need a non-governmental forum where you can have this conversation. One quick story, you know, I was asking my 15-year-old son about this whole privacy issue. And not shockingly to the under 20 set, they view privacy as a generational issue.
Yeah, get over it.
Right, they get it. Well, I'm on Facebook, I'm on MySpace, I Twitter, I do this, I do that. Wait, I'm not worried about privacy. I make decisions every day to put information out there, and I don't know who's looking at it. And so it'll be interesting to see. I don't know if that's right, but it'll be interesting to see how this debate shifts over time.
Yeah. Way in the back there, sir. Yes. Yeah. Would you mind bringing him the microphone? Yeah.
Lynn Matthijs. I see him.
I think we have a...
Oh, sorry.
Fran, two questions. First one is, as you know, Executive 12333, when that executive order was issued, it has a double-edged sword in it in private sector outreach programs mandating them in the government. The good news is that it has private sector outreach program requirements. The bad news is it has private sector outreach program requirements. If every agency in the government starts getting engaged out there and starts checking the box that they've got their private sector outreach program in place, how do we get the government into a coordinated fashion so that the private sector isn't inundated with all these cross-sector activities going on with the government doing their outreach programs, and I'll give you a follow-up after that.
Yeah, you know, you asked me, having tried this and failed, I will tell you, this came up for me in the context of FBI, who may be going out to have just a sort of a private sector relationship, or maybe going out to serve a subpoena, the CIA, who has a private sector program, and then DHS was creating these sector coordinating councils. And literally, it was a group of CEOs who said, you know, somebody comes in there talking to my chief security officer, another agency comes in there talking to my general counsel, and then somebody invites me to dinner. Little do I know I'm going to get pitched. And so, can't you help me with this? And I called the 3 cabinet secretaries together, and we had a conversation about it. The problem is their interests and their objectives in those relationships are very different. You don't want to be in a position of interfering in any way with service of process, with the FBI. You can't inhibit them. So my notion was, isn't there a way that we can have a system that allows us to gatekeep, so we at least have general situational awareness about who's gone into which companies and at what level? And as you can imagine, there are counterintelligence and all sorts of intelligence concerns with such a system. I tried, I failed, but I get it. Let me put it that way. I get that the government needs to do this better, because I hear it now all the time. I'll tell you, I don't have a good answer for you, but I think we need to engage with the business roundtable and CEOs to understand what's their view of how we could do this more effectively.
And you had a quick follow-up, I think.
Yeah, the follow-up I have is, as you mentioned earlier, the consistent attacks on the United States by foreign governments and foreign entities. You know, the government knows there's over 140 countries actively and aggressively stealing technology from us. The Obama administration in February 2009 issued their report saying that over $1 trillion conservatively was stolen from the economy, from intellectual property, just in 2008 alone. when I broached this question to the Director of National Intelligence, Blair, he gave me a response of, well, it's somewhere between stopping global hunger and world peace in trying to fix this problem. How do we get the resources of the government focused at understanding that, you know, we're one of the few elements in the domestic world, in the developed world, that doesn't have an industrial policy, and that you can't just vilify business all the time. You've got to have business to support the long-term growth of the country.
Yeah, Lynn, you're dead on here. Look, the legal authorities exist to investigate and prosecute these. I'm a firm believer on this, as well as, by the way, leaks of classified information, that an occasional indictment, whether you win or lose that case, is not a bad thing. It sends a message.
Shot, yeah.
And so, frankly, we need a real concerted effort against the economic crimes, especially in a time, you know, of economic uncertainty in this country. When better to decide you were going to launch such an initiative? I think it's a question of competing priorities and competing, you know, demands on resources. But I think it's necessary, and I think it can be done in a way that gets an awful lot of attention to this issue.
Last two questions, the gentleman there and the gentleman here. I'll give some right there. No, I'm sorry, up front.
Dan Perito.
Yeah. But first with the guy in yellow, sorry. Yeah. And if we have time, I'll get to one more, but I have to get Fran out at 2. Yeah.
Okay, now that works. Bill Gatius from Arete Associates. Fran, kind of a softball. We've heard a lot about how Americans have to pitch in for our nation's security, but we have a whole host of foreign countries, many of whom are cyber attacking us, that we rely on. You had a lot of experience, and I was wondering if you could sort of characterize in a 60-second global trot, who do you think and why are our foreign partners so important to us in fighting Al-Qaeda and its affiliates? And who are some of the strange friends that we can talk about, obviously, besides the traditional allies? Thanks.
Yeah, look, we understood, and Bill was a part of this, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, saying that your allies, your closest ally is the British, is good and is necessary, but isn't sufficient. You had to go to the places and create alliances with people where the problem really existed. And I'm going to tell you that that was not easy. There was deep sense of mistrust and suspicion, whether you're talking about Pakistan and the allies there, or you're talking about Saudi Arabia. And I will tell you, I think people would be absolutely stunned when you realize that 15 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11 were Saudis. If I told you that we share thousands upon thousands of intelligence reports every year with them, literally rivaling our counterterrorism relationship with our British allies, I think people would be surprised. Why? Because, let's not kid ourselves, a good deal of this is the Saudis see the threat to themselves and see it as in their own national interest to cooperate with us. That's not a bad thing. Why they cooperate is less important to me than that they do. And so, I mean, I think you're seeing this. Look, we need to get to a point where you're now doing that in a place like Yemen. We need to get to a place, there's no central government in Somalia that we can rely on, but you need these places where the threats emanate from are the most critical partnerships that you need to strengthen and build. Sometimes that means you got to go in and build the capability that they don't have, and then provide them the capability so that they can share. And those are long-term and they're expensive commitments, make no mistake about it, but they are invaluable in terms of the intelligence that they provide.
Hi there, Fran. Thank you.
Hi, Dan.
Dan Prieto from IBM and former participant in Markle Foundation Task Force. I want to thank the conversants and also Secretary Chertoff for pointing out 2 things on information sharing. The technology is there. It is not a technology issue. And second of all, the privacy issues, while critical, maybe less than we think from a generational standpoint, and there's lots of privacy protective technology. In light of that, what are the biggest remaining hurdles? And the 2 that I see are, how do you get data to find data without being flooded? You talked about artificial intelligence and alerts. How do you get that to happen? And how do you get it to happen, particularly when the owners of data still rest on the conditions under which they originally got the data? You have people saying, I'd love to share it with you, but the restrictions say I can't, even if it's anonymized. So you end up in a catch-22. You can't look at the data without a predicate, and you can't figure out if you have a predicate unless you look at the data.
Right. Look, I do think we've got to get over the traditional rules. We can't, it can't any longer be okay to say, I'd like to share it with you, but I can't. So tell me why you can't, and let's solve that problem. But we've got to challenge those I can'ts and solve them. I mean, I don't think we've taken a hard enough turn on that. And nowhere is this more difficult, and again, back to Secretary Chertoff, who struggled with this, whether it's the EU and passenger name recognition, or state and locals or regulatory agencies who acquired it for a different purpose. Those can all be solved. It really just requires the hard work of deciding you're going to do it, and then you're going to be public about it. I mean, I think you've got to be honest about what the rules of the road are you're operating under, and be willing to give yourself over. I mean, look, congressional oversight, I will take a 10-second screed on. You know, it is dysfunctional. The department gets pulled in 1,000 different directions. But really good oversight could be put against this in a very responsible way that helps solve the problem. And I think that's what needs to happen.
Can they be solved all at once, or do you have to do it one by one by one by one?
Well, I mean, look, not each of these issues is equal. I think you've got to prioritize which pockets of information are the most valuable. And then I think you've got to have a very disciplined system to go against each of them.
Last question. There was a gentleman I passed up way back there. Sorry.
Dan Dunkel, New Era Associates. In regards to my friend Lynn Matthijs's statement about intellectual property, cybercrime being $1 trillion problem, I'm interested in your thoughts as to, being that since Americans are the #1 target because we're the most innovative people in the world, why haven't the politicians picked up on the fact that this is an American jobs lost issue? I rarely, if ever, hear anything about that, and I'm interested in what your thoughts might be.
Yeah, look, I think this isn't a good answer, but I think it's the honest one. I mean, I just think this becomes down to a question of priorities and resources. People are worried about stuff blowing up, and nobody wants to be the one who takes agents off of the CT watch, right, and puts them on the Economic Crimes Bureau. But I think we need to understand that agents, we can move resources around depending on a threat. And I think we have to make up our minds to devote resources. I can remember talking to somebody at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They have a whole private sector, basically prosecution of intellectual property cases. They do the investigation themselves, and then they bring it to the government because they can't get the government interested to do its fundamental job. I mean, that's a problem. That ought to be an embarrassment to the Justice Department and to the FBI. I think you need to bring just a couple big cases, but look what Hollywood does. I mean, and Commissioner Bratton knows it. Hollywood has this whole effort against fakes, frauds, whether it's DVDs or purses. And while that's an important piece to the effort, that doesn't abrogate the government's responsibility for doing the job itself. Before we wrap up, can I take just a second to sort of thank. I think this is a really important opportunity. These kinds of conversations don't get had absent something like the Aspen Institute. Thank you to Clark for all the effort and the staff that went into that. I think this is terrific that you've been willing to do it, and I hope you'll find that there's interest to continue it, because I think it's important.
I think it really is. I think public engagement is the only way to overcome some of these issues. Fran Townsend.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the service to the nation.
Thank you, Fran. You're wonderful. I'll be in touch.
Okay,
thank you.
I'm sorry Jane wasn't more straight with you. That's why I said that.
We're going to break for 10 minutes and then reconvene at 2:15.